that have been made available to support various programs in the continent, and critical areas, areas such as health, areas such as agriculture and the production that would ensue because of good partnerships. So we have seen a difference. We have also seen a difference in terms of the level of involvement of the private sector from Denmark and Africa, and I'll focus primarily on Kenya. Definitely, we are seeing more involvement of the private sector from Denmark in Africa. And I can just give one example, for instance. If one was to look at the logistics involvement or investment in Kenya, your company here, Maersk, actually handles about 30 to 40% of all our imports in terms of the logistics as a country. And about 50% of our exports are actually in the hands of Maersk. They do the shipping. So that is a very critical engagement that we have. And I was joking earlier with, I think the ambassador, and I was saying if Maersk went on holiday for a few days or a month for that matter, then you can imagine what it would do to critical raw materials that are required in Kenya and what it would do to our exports. So there is indeed a significant difference, a significant improvement between the level of engagement 15 years ago and today. Thank you.
Okay. And I'll ask you the same question, Lars Løkke Rasmussen. How has Europe and Denmark's perspective on Africa changed from your perspective the past, let's say, decade?
Well, basically it was all the dimensions mentioned in the Prime Minister's speech, and no reason to repeat all of that. But honestly speaking, I think among other things, it was an eye-opener when we had this Russian full-fledged illegal invasion in Ukraine, and we turned to our African friends who have a past have been colonized and should be the very first to emphasize the need for everybody to uphold the UN Charter, etc. And we saw that many of them actually abstained. I think that was a true eye-opener for many, many, many people in Western Europe. And is, among other things, a reason for a stronger engagement. Not to solve the Ukrainian war, but because it proves a point that we haven't engaged enough on an equal platform. And I think one important thing, even though it's pretty banal, is the fact that we shouldn't look at Africa as Africa. We have this very famous Danish child song, Africa, Africa. Yeah, and it goes like, Africa, the country all kids know. And you know, Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent which consists of 54 different countries. And they are not on an equal footing. I mean, some of them are prosperous countries, as Kenya is an anchor of stability in the region. Others are facing severe security problems and problems when it comes to democracy, etc., the whole Sahel region. So a part of this is looking at the continent Africa in a much more nuanced way. And if you do that, you will realize that there is also, from a business perspective, huge potential in some countries and perhaps not in others. And that's why we need this more holistic approach, which is the core idea behind this new strategy. Many other reasons as well. I will try to be brief, but look at the demographic. I mean, when 1/4 of the total population on this earth will be an African in 2050, and 1/3 of all youngsters. And we are talking about a continent close to our continent, like 14 kilometers, I mean. Then there's no doubt that we will be witnessing lots of Africans on our continent in like 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. We just have to decide in what capacity do we want to welcome them. As partners, business partners, students, or as, for instance, climate refugees. So it is in the interest of humanity, but it's also in our own pure interest from a security point of view that we engage in Africa.
And Dr. Mudavadi, as the foreign minister just mentioned, Africa is probably one of the most diverse continent in the world. 54 countries, as he just mentioned, with completely different economies, with completely different cultures. I think 2,000 different languages are being spoken. Yet the West often tends to talk about Africa as a whole. Do you feel that the West lacks nuance in its perspective on Africa? And if so, is that not a problem in terms of creating an equal partnership?
Well, there are quite a number of issues that arise. Your first question was whether we've seen a difference in engagement. The truth is, yes, there has been a difference in engagement. Now, what is the nature of this engagement? What is the structure of this engagement? Becomes the very important issue that my colleague, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, is raising here. Because the question is this engagement having the necessary impact? Is it just growing in terms of numbers but skewed towards one part of the globe, that is the Europe or Denmark for that matter? Or is it also having that impact that it should have on the African continent? For instance, Kenya has just finished the agreement, the EPA, European Partnership, Economic Partnership Agreement. The first for us, the first perhaps in Africa, if I'm not too wrong. Now the question is, can we then move to the phase of proper implementation? And we appreciate that this is a milestone because the EU Parliament has endorsed this agreement with an overwhelming majority, but can we now implement it? Can we see the benefits of that agreement? Because if you look at the trade numbers, they're still very grim comparatively to what comes to Europe and what the African continent gets in terms of their trade balances. So there is an issue there, and I think with this strategy, if it's going to yield a structure of engagement that has even greater impact in the livelihoods and helping the African countries get out of poverty and crisis, then it will make a lot of sense. And therefore it's an initiative that needs to be looked at and anchored. For instance, if we were to talk about the WTO, what can the European Union, what can Denmark do to help Africa as a continent navigate some of the extremely stringent and difficult regulations within the WTO? So we may be doing something here with the European Union, but then the broader WTO engagement of trade and involvement becomes a big challenge. The other thing that I would quickly just again pick up is Africa is also facing challenges. The geopolitics globally, and again there's the mention of the Ukraine challenge, we have the Gaza and so forth. I was trying to pick some details out of the what you'd call just some statistical data. What, for instance, in the last few years has the US Congress set aside to deal with issues of conflict and war, and how much has actually gone to actual intervention when it comes to poverty alleviation or trade or serious programs. And the figures are scary. It shows that these conflicts, these global conflicts, are sucking the resources away from the targeted areas which would make a very big difference, whether in education, health, or food security. The conflicts are sucking the resources out of everybody. And therefore, one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is strategy that we're putting in place be structured so that we can get more resources going to actual production as opposed to conflict.
And yes, and we'll get back to the implementation part later on, but talking about geopolitics, it's been mentioned many times during this event already. Geopolitics are shifting. China and Russia are playing an increasingly bigger role on the African continent. I'd like to ask you,
You ask me?
yes, I asked you.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I would prefer to...
No, we'll get Mudavadi'S perspective in just a moment. But from your perspective, should we be worried?
Yes, of course we should be to some extent. But first of all, we have to be realistic about it. I mean, there's no way we can force our African friends not to engage with the rest of the world. I mean, I try when I travel, I try before I go to bed late in the night, I try to... just to make this mental exercise, what would be my own opinion if I was this guy I just met with earlier that day, you know? If I was the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, landlocked, or if I was the President in Kenya, I know very well I'm not either of those, but what would be my perspective? I mean, then I would be eager to try to go along a pathway leading towards more prosperity, and for that I would be looking for international partners to partner up with. I would be looking for investments. And if others are, you know, proposing investments and make them available, and we do not, because we have a tendency to preach, and it's not because human rights is not important, democracy is not important, it is important. But we have to take account what is the situation these countries are in, so to speak.
Okay.
And therefore we should engage more. And if we engage more, we will have a stronger partnership, and it will be easier in the long run to partner up also in geopolitical questions. And we can't have a situation where we just call for our African friends when we need them in Ukraine, for instance. We should engage more heavily in all these agendas, some of them mentioned by the Prime Minister, the need for reform at the FTA, the financial architecture, the need for reformed UN, etc., building up capacity within the African Union, supporting your President, which is very strong on this. We have to move from aid to trade. We have to create an Eastern Africa single market. I mean, this is one-to-one our philosophy, and that's what have brought prosperity to Denmark and Europe, and we support our
but just a follow-up, just a quick follow-up question here, because almost every time the Danish government talks about Africa, it mentions China in the same breath. You've done it here as well.
Ask me about it.
Yeah, a published a piece in a Danish newspaper under the headline, quote, China is actively strengthening its position in the important Africa. It is essential that Denmark does the same. So my question to you is, can you understand if some people think it's difficult to establish an equal partnership if the premise of your involvement is to reduce Chinese influence rather than to help the African countries?
But that's not the most important argument. It's an argument I use primarily today because you asked me. I mean, there are two good reasons, and one of them is, idealistic. We are all humans, and it's a part of our DNA, and that's why Denmark is among it's a handful of countries in the world meeting the UN request on 0.7 for ODA. But it's more than that. I mean, this is our neighbors. And I gave you the figures. When this population grows into be, the biggest continent on Earth, 1/4 of all citizens in the world, 1/3 of all youngsters, then it goes without saying that we need to establish a more equal neighborship. For two reasons. One is to avoid what could be an outcome if there's not a prosperity future in Africa, a huge migration pressure on Europe. And another, which is equally important, is that this is an opportunity. I mean, dealing with our neighbors is the most obvious thing to do. And in 2060, there will be 1.1 billion people in the middle class in Africa. It comes with huge opportunities, not least for a country as Denmark, with our strongholds in greening the economy, etc.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's not just to avoid that someone else become a closer friend to Africa. It's because it is in our own selfish interest to be a good partner. And that's why the ambition is to move this relationship to a friendship. And I think the preconditions are pretty good because we have a strong history. We have not been colonizing Africa. I mean, the Nordics have a good reputation in Africa.
Okay, and we're already deep into overtime, so just briefly here, in the end, two key drivers for stronger partnerships between Africa and Europe. What would you underline or emphasize there?
I think we should look at it in the sense that it should be sustainable. Whatever we do, how we engage, it should be sustainable. We should be become aware of the ecological challenges that we face globally, and therefore the green agenda, the green initiative is absolutely critical, because it's not just physical conflict, human conflict that is generating problems, but conflict is also being accelerated with the ecological challenges that we face. So to me, these are very critical areas that we need to look at. Let me also just quickly flag something. The competition is healthy, even amongst friends. It's a question of how you structure this process. And I would say what he says, what my colleague here has said is that as other players come into the arena, let us focus on what are they focusing on, what are they targeting, and what is the niche that Europe can target, and how meaningful can it be? And because quite a number of situations are causing desperation in Africa. Let me give the very critical example. We have 16 landlocked countries in Africa. And not too long ago, two of our neighbors, Kenya's neighbors, that is Ethiopia and Somalia, have gone into a tense moment. Now, what, for instance, can Europe do? Because the challenge here is how do the landlocked countries get access to the sea to deal with their legitimate rights of global trade? These are fundamental issues. And at the same time, they have to do it through a negotiated process because they have to recognize the territorial sovereignty of these individual countries. What, for instance, would Europe be doing or considering in terms of looking at the investment infrastructure.
Yes.
That would help ease such a problem.
Yes, and I think perhaps later on, excuse me, I hate to interrupt you here, but...
Yeah, so let me, just that extra minute, I want to bring it, because you see, this, when we look at infrastructure, perhaps this may now even re-engineer the strategy around infrastructure. There's very little trade amongst African countries themselves. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, but the percentage of intra-African trade is very little. So that means the connectivity levels are poor. That should be a niche that Europe should capitalize on, so that they can help in that interconnectivity.
Okay.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, that concludes this segment. Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives. And while the two foreign ministers leave the stage, I would like to welcome the Danish Minister of Development Cooperation and Global Climate Policy, Dan Jørgensen, and Chief Minister of Sierra Leone, Dr. David Senke. Please make your way to the stage. David Senke has taken the global stage as an example of the transformative potential of young African leadership. He's author to the book Radical Inclusion. He has a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he has a wealth of experience negotiating solutions and finding innovative ways of unleashing the potential of African youth. And